Thank you. I made a few notes and have them here. I have preached probably over 4,000 times in my ministry, but I retired in June and had not preached since June. So I thought I better have some notes just in case I got up here and nothing came out. Actually, I preached at 9 o'clock. I hope I do better this time. Sarah asked me told me two things about preaching here today. The first was she wanted me to be sure and talk about what an honor and a privilege it has been for me to have the chance to work with her. And what a great job she has been doing. And she has been doing a great job. I remember 8 years ago meeting Sarah for the first time. She was walking down the hall in her plaid shirt and blue jeans to the interview with our church for the position of youth director. And I met her and I thought, oh, well, she's a nice kid. We've already interviewed some really good people, and it's nice to meet her. And she went into the interview with our staff parish relations committee, and 45 minutes later after she left, we just sat there and everybody said, we've never interviewed anybody like Sarah. And you know what I mean. So I'm just very honored to be able to preach here with Sarah. Second thing Sarah said was that you all like long sermons. That worried me a little bit, but she promised me a clock, so if it got too long, I would be okay, but she forgot and left the clock home. So it's only 10:03, so we're in good shape. No, here's a signal. If I preach too long, just one by one, quietly leave. Got it? Okay. I want to talk this morning about how God gives to the people of God the resources, the money, the means to be the people of God. Are you hearing me again?
I'm hearing you. I just come to all three.
Well, my goodness, I appreciate that. My wife won't even do that for me. So.
You must have done that.
So I want to talk about how God cares for God's church, God's people. I've noticed through 45 years of ministry that God does not write checks to the church treasury. I have to have a talk with God about that. It just doesn't work that way. And in more modern times, neither does God direct deposit money to your bank account. It just doesn't work that way. Now, once in a while, you get surprised. Near where my mother lives in the mountains of North Carolina, there's a little country church. A little cemetery and just little brick church. And a lady in the church passed away and left the church a bequest of $1 million. The only challenge was that she stipulated it had to be used for the care of the cemetery. They have the best looking cemetery you have ever seen in your life, and all the grounds around it. But I kind of wish that she had left it for the care of the living. Sometimes God works that way. But as I read the Bible, I discover there are a lot of ways that God works with God's people, and most of them are kind of ordinary. Let me share a few with you. First of all, let me first read from the 7th chapter of Luke, and then I'll circle back to this passage. Jesus has been invited to the home of a Pharisee. Now, Pharisees get a bad name, but actually Pharisees thought a lot like Jesus. They just got carried away and a little full of themselves. They spent a lot of time with Jesus because they were intrigued by what he was saying. But, sometimes you argue the most with the people you're closest to. That's what the Pharisees were doing. One of the Pharisees invited Jesus to eat with him. After he entered the Pharisee's home, he took his place at the table. Meanwhile, a woman from the city, a sinner. Oh, can't we just imagine what kind of sinner she was? And don't we imagine? Because it doesn't say. But we got lots of imagination. Discovered that Jesus was dining in the Pharisee's home, and she brought perfumed oil in a vase made of alabaster, which is a very expensive translucent stone that had been carved into a vase and has a very expensive oil in it. She brought it, and standing before him at his feet and crying, she began to wet his feet with her tears. She wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured the oil on them. When the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw what had happened, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman this is that's touching him. He would know that she is a sinner." And Jesus said, "Simon, I have something to say to you." "Teacher, speak," he said. A certain lender had two debtors that owed him money. One a little bit of money, one a lot. And the lender, realizing that neither could pay, forgave them both. Now, Simon, which one of those two debtors was more grateful? And he said, "Well, I suppose the one who was forgiven the greater debt." And Jesus says, "Bingo. That's right. The one to whom much has been forgiven will be the one who's most grateful." Simon, do you see this woman? Now, when I came into your house, you didn't wash my feet, didn't make me comfortable, you just had me go to the table. This woman has not stopped crying and washing my feet with her tears and drying them with her hair. She is anointing my head with this perfume, and she is, in fact, anointing my body for my burial, which will come before long. She has loved me so much because she has been forgiven so much. I tell you that her many sins have been forgiven, so she has shown great love. The one who is forgiven little loves little. And then Luke does an interesting thing. He tells this story, and then he moves over right in the next chapter. And, they didn't have chapter divisions in the Bible till a few centuries ago. So when Luke's writing it, it moves right on to the next part of it, where he says this: "Soon afterwards, Jesus traveled through the cities and villages, preaching and proclaiming the good news of God's kingdom. The 12 disciples were with him, along with some women who had been healed of evil spirits and sicknesses. Among them were Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had been driven out, Joanna, the wife of Herod's servant, Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their resources." Men, and especially these women named, who've been healed of illness, cured of the evil spirits, the illness, the mental illness perhaps that had been bothering them. And by the way, Mary Magdalene, we always assume Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. Do you know why we think that? I don't know. It doesn't say it in the Bible. We just kind of like to think that. But actually it says she was a woman who was healed of 7 evil spirits. All of these women, the thing they have in common is that Jesus had loved them and graced them, forgiven them or healed them, and so they followed him and provided for his needs and his ministry out of their resources. We'll come back to that. Well, as you read through the Bible, one of the things you discover is that most of the time the people in the Bible are poor. For most of Bible history, most people who trust in God are very poor people. They're just on the margins. They're on the edge. They're just at the edge of dying of starvation or dying of thirst, or they don't have much. They're just on the edge. Now, I know Sarah tells me this congregation is filthy rich. I know your biggest problem is, what do we do with all this money? But for most faithful people through history, they've been struggling. They've just been barely making it. So I know you can't identify, but try. Actually, it's hard for modern Americans to identify with the people of the Bible because we all have so much, and they had so little. And so all they had really was God. I want to tell you the story from Exodus 16 about the people of Israel when they left slavery. You know that the Israelites had gone to Egypt, and over a period of centuries they became enslaved. They found themselves helpless and hopeless under the power of Pharaoh and the greatest kingdom the world had known. They were dirt. They were the tools that Pharaoh used to build his empire. And they had nothing and no hope. They prayed to God. And to me, one of the great passages in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, and God heard their prayers, and God remembered his covenant with them. And he calls Moses and sends Moses to confront Pharaoh, and the unbelievable, impossible happens. Pharaoh's power is overthrown, and the slaves are set free. They cross the Red Sea, and they head out through the Sinai desert toward Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments and on to the Promised Land. But it wasn't that simple. You know, they are set free. They see Pharaoh vanquished. They're heading out into the desert. And you know what they start saying? Are we there yet? I'm thirsty. I'm hungry. My feet hurt. It's hot. It's dusty. Why didn't we stay back in Egypt? At least Pharaoh fed us back there and we had our huts to live in. I don't like this. You've never been that way. Now, I've had the privilege of being in the Sinai Desert. I've been in Israel many times. Becky and I are going to be there again the first 3 weeks of April. We'll be staying in Jerusalem. And as I've been many times, Sarah's been with us several times. And I did the opposite of what the Hebrews did. They left Egypt and went through the Sinai Desert to Mount Sinai and on to the Promised Land. I'll be leaving. I left Israel, went down to Mount Sinai, then through the Sinai Desert and back to Egypt. We never ran into each other, but and it's an incredible experience to be in the middle of the desert and go up to 5,500 feet where you start climbing Mount Sinai. Started climbing at 2 in the morning, pitch black, brilliant stars, no artificial light, at 5,000, 6,000 feet, just brilliant, bright stars, except for this one space over here where there are no stars. And I finally realized that was the mountain. Climb up to 7,700 feet to watch the sunrise over the mountains in the desert. And I could picture God speaking to Moses there. And come down the mountain. And then we got on the bus and we started driving toward Egypt. Now, we had plenty of money. We were ready to eat, hungry. There's no place to find food. Now, the desert there, we think of desert, we think of the Foreign Legion walking through the sand dunes, or maybe R2-D2 going through the sand dunes. But the desert there is a flint desert. It looks more like a construction site where they lay down sand and then gravel. That's more the kind of desert it is. There's just not much there. So we're bussing along, and we're getting hungry, and we got money. In fact, we've already paid for lunch, but where we're going to get it? You know what they had to do? They had to send a taxi from Cairo with 40 boxed lunches in it, a 3-hour drive to meet us in the desert. Now, the people of Israel had money because they had taken the gold of Egypt when they left. But you can't eat gold. There's no food out there, no place to buy food. And there was no taxi to bring it from Cairo. We're hungry, we're starving. What do we do? Well, 16th chapter of Exodus. The Lord spoke to Moses, 11th verse. I've heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will have your fill of bread. Then you will know that I'm the Lord your God. In the evening a flock of quail flew down and covered the camp. And in the morning there was a layer of dew all around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the desert surface were thin flakes, as thin as frost on the ground. What is it? They said. Manna. Manna from heaven. So every evening, they'd light their fires, put out their frying pans, and quail would jump into them. And every morning, they'd get up, and there'd be donuts. Bread, manna, you know. And they had to learn to trust. God said, now every morning there'll be enough for you. You don't need to hoard it. There'll be enough. But, you know, they're slow learners, so they gather up the manna. They gather up bags of manna to eat that day, and the next morning they get up, and that bag is rotted. It stunk. But there was more manna there. So they finally learned you can trust God. Every day there'll be manna there for you. Except on the Sabbath, which is Saturday morning. None then, but I'll give you a double portion the day before. You can save that. And so they learned through the years to trust God. They never had too much, but they always had enough. So that's a great example of how God provides whatever it is the people need. They didn't need money. They needed food, and God gave it to them. Another example I love is in the story of the patriarchs. Before the exile, before the Exodus from Egypt, in fact, the reason the Hebrews got to Egypt in the first place was the old story of Joseph. And this takes place in Genesis, the 41st chapter. Actually, there's a lot of chapters about Joseph. Joseph was a great kid. He was Daddy's favorite kid. He's the one that Daddy bought the Mustang for, or a multicolored coat. The other brothers, yeah, they're okay, but he's my pride and joy, my Joseph. Did you ever have a sibling like that? You know, and how'd you feel about it? You hated him. Well, Joseph's brothers hated him for this. They hated him so much that one day they had him out in the field and they threw him in a pit and they were going to kill him. And then they decided, no, better yet, we'll make some money off him. And they sold him to a caravan heading off to Egypt to be a slave. End of story. Not with God. The story picks up in Egypt. Joseph's an enterprising guy, and he makes good, and he starts working for one of the important people in Egypt, and he's just doing really, really well. And he's a good moral guy, and that's a problem because his employer's wife thinks he's pretty special and would like to express her gratitude to him for being there in the household. You understand? And he says, oh, no, I'm not that kind of guy. And so she gets mad and gets him thrown in prison, where he sits until somebody shows up in prison who is on the Pharaoh's staff and starts having these dreams, and Joseph interprets the dreams for him. And to make a long story short, the dreams come true, and he's released, but Joseph says to him, now look, I'm rotting here in prison. When you get out, put in a good word for me and help me get out of prison? The guy says, oh, yeah, I'll be sure and do that. You can count on me. Not. 2 years later, the guy's working for the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh starts having dreams. And Pharaoh says, oh, I wish I had somebody that could interpret dreams. The guy says, oh, son of a gun, I forgot. I'm supposed to get him out of prison. There's somebody in prison that can do this for you. Well, let's go get him. Don't you like the Bible's so real? It's about real people that do real stupid things sometimes, as well as some real good things. So, 41st chapter of Genesis. So Pharaoh summoned Joseph, and they brought him out of the dungeon. He shaved, changed clothes, appeared before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said, I had a dream, but no one could interpret it. Tell me what it means. Okay, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile. In front of me, 7 fatted, stout cows climbed up out of the Nile and grazed on the reeds. Just then, 7 more cows, weak and frail and thin, climbed up after them. I've never seen such awful cows in all the land of Egypt. Then those thin, frail cows devoured the first 7 fatted cows. And then the same thing happened with some corn. What's this mean? And Joseph says, it's easy. 7 fatted cows, you're going to have 7 really incredibly prosperous years. Crops, it's going to be great. And then you're going to have 7 years of famine that just destroys the land. Pharaoh says, what are we going to do? Joseph said, easy. You find somebody who's wise and a good leader, and you get them to take 20% of the crop every year for 7 years, which is, by my math, 140% of the crop. Take 20% of the crop every year and store it up, so when those 7 bad years come, you'll have enough you can distribute and get your people through. Now you see, that is a great example of how God doesn't just provide manna. What God provides is some leader with good common sense. And then they follow through on it. So Pharaoh, of course, appoints Joseph to be the second most powerful man in Egypt to do this. A similar kind of thing, I've done a lot of weddings in my time, and I always counsel the couple, and when it's a young couple especially, I say to them, okay, said, are you both working? And they say, oh, yes, we're both working. We have to, to make ends meet. And I said, great. Now, if you will put the salary of one of you in the bank for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, you'll never have to worry about money again, because you'll always have money in the bank. You won't have to borrow money. You'll have some savings, and you won't, when an emergency comes up, you'll have the money to take care of it. And they always say, oh, but we can't. We need both salaries to live on. And so I say, yes, but what if one of you gets laid off? I got a good friend whose company just folded over the weekend, and he had no job on Monday. Or you get pregnant, or you break your leg, or if you had to get by on one salary, you'd do it, wouldn't you? And they said, well, yeah, I guess we would. And I said, okay, pretend. Pretend for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Put that money aside. Then go back to spending both of them if you want to. But for the rest of your lives, your financial life will be different, and you won't be worrying about money. See, that's Pharaoh's dream. When things are going well, put some aside, and you'll have it for the tough times. That's one of the ways that God provides for God's people, by teaching us to have the good sense to manage well. No miracle involved there, just good, providential, common sense care. It happens once in a while. I think I've had 2 couples come back to me and say they did that out of 350. Elijah in the Old Testament, 1 Kings chapter 17. Let's see. That would be right about here, wouldn't it? Yep. Elijah and the widow from Zarephath. There's a famine in the land. Elijah the prophet is journeying through the land, and he comes to a house and he says, please, may I have something to eat and a little water? And she says, as surely as the Lord your God lives, I don't have any food, only a handful of flour in a jar and a bit of oil in a bottle. This is chapter 17, verse 11 now. I'm collecting 2 sticks so that I can make some to burn, so I can make some food for myself and my son. We'll eat the last of the food and then we'll die. See, people in the Bible are always living on the edge. This is my last food. We'll eat it and then we'll lie down and die. And Elijah says, be generous. Feed me too. Trust God. So she feeds Elijah. And there's just enough to feed the 3 of them. And then she lies down to die. But when she wakes up in the morning, she discovers that there is a little bit of oil left in the jar and a little bit of flour left in the jar. Just enough to get her through the day. And that night she goes to bed. And the next morning she discovers there's just enough oil and flour to get her through that day. And the next day, and the next. And every day she slowly learns that there'll be just enough for her to get by. And that she can trust God. Your church may learn that kind of lesson. It's just enough. Just enough to do our work this day. There's a passage in Jesus talks a lot about money in the New Testament, but one of my favorites is in the 17th chapter of Matthew. Some people are getting on Jesus. They're giving Jesus a hard time. And they say, hey, you haven't paid your temple tax. Well, everybody was supposed to pay a half shekel to support the temple. And Jesus says, I don't have to have a building, a temple, to worship God. I don't have to pay that tax. But I don't want to offend you, so I'll pay it. Well, what about Peter? He hadn't paid either. Okay. So let's say half shekel for me, half shekel for Peter. That'd be what? 1 shekel? Do you know how much a shekel's worth? I don't either. Now, I know what it is today because 4 shekels make $1. But back then, I'm not sure, but it was, it was a significant amount. So what Jesus says to Peter is this, said, Peter, you're a fisherman. Go down to the Sea of Galilee. Throw your hook in. First fish you catch, open up its mouth and find a shekel in it and pay the tax for both of us. Peter goes down, catches fish. There's a shekel in it, pays the tax. This is Sarah's preferred method of stewardship. She spends a lot of time fishing, and she always looks at gift fish in the mouth. So, you try it. Try some more fishing. See if they're good, and they're good to eat. Yeah. They think that the fish that Peter caught was a tilapia, because they have a habit when they're building their nests of picking up shiny objects in their mouths. Yeah. Fried fish. Oh, yeah, fried tilapia. You had fried mullet last night. Yeah, oh, yeah. Oh, don't get me started on this. Yeah. Hey, we can stay here and preach. I'll preach a long time, start talking about all this good food here. Good. And French fries. Yeah, you were with us at dinner last night, weren't you? All you could eat. Oh, I could hardly move. And this would, and of course, I'm not even going to reference the story of Jesus and the loaves and fishes. You know that story. I don't need to bring that one up. Was that fried? Not fried. Okay. As I read the Bible, though, I think the most common way that God gives to the people of God the money to do the work is from this passage I read you at the beginning, Luke 7 and 8, where grateful people simply share in the work of God. It's not the super rich. It's not this, winning the lottery. It's not $1 million bequest. Although if any of you would like to consider doing that, talk to me, talk to Sarah. We can help you set that up. Boy, would that make a difference. I've had that happen in my church. We set up several scholarships out of bequests in my church. It makes a difference. But it's that everyday supporting that ministry that Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Susanna and those other women did, this unnamed woman who comes and cares for Jesus why? Because he had loved her, because he had graced her, he had healed, he had forgiven, he'd given them life, he'd given them hope. I wanted to introduce another member of the family. Sarah's sort of a member of the family, but I brought another member of the family along. He doesn't get out very much. But I've got him here with me. In fact, he's pretty shy. I haven't had him out of my study in years. Would you grab that bag? This is Pig. My mother's name for him was Pig. Very, poetic name. And despite the pink roses, he's a he. Pig has been in the family longer than I have. My dad was a United Methodist minister, and he served the church, before I was born, he served the church in Zolfo Springs, Florida. How many of you know where Zolfo Springs is? 4 people. Great. You think you live in a small town here in Inverness. Zolfo Springs, Florida is where my dad was serving the church. And back then, when the offering time came, people put in dimes, quarters, maybe a dollar bill in the offering plate. And I'm not sure they even had a bank account back then. What the treasurer would do after church was to pay my dad from the offering plate. Hopefully they counted it first. But paid my dad with the quarters, the dimes, the dollar bills from the offering plate. And my dad set aside some of those quarters, half dollars, and put them in Pig. And you can still, Pig's gotten a little bald on top, just like me here from those coins going in there. And when it was time for me to be born, my parents went to the large city of Wauchula. How many of you know where Wauchula is? Few more of you. Yeah, it's a little bit bigger. I had a hospital in Wauchula. And I was born, and they paid the doctor's bill from Pig, which enabled me to be born and to grow up and go into the ministry, and then years later to hire Sarah. And Sarah's gone into the ministry. So without Pig, Sarah would not be here today. Sort of. Now you see, it was Zolfo Springs is not a prosperous town. It was those faithful people in that church giving to the ministry of that church that made my dad's ministry and then my ministry possible, and then been able to see people like Sarah come along afterwards. And I don't know the names of any of those people who gave, but I know that I owe them a debt of gratitude. And perhaps all of us do. Those who went before us faithfully giving out of their resources so that the good news could be preached and the gospel shared. That's what you're about. That's what you're doing. And you do it not out of guilt. Guilt's not a good motivator. You don't do it so that you'll get rich. A lot of people have tried that. Doesn't usually work. You give because you're grateful. That's why the woman came to Jesus at the dinner. That's why those women supported Jesus' ministry, because he'd healed them. He'd accepted them. He had forgiven them. He loved them. You are not a wealthy congregation. And so you have something in common with the widow whom Elijah met. If you're really trying to do God's work and not just doing what you want to do, but really trying to do what God wants done, God will find a way to give you the means. Now, most of the time, it's not going to be manna falling from heaven. Most of the time, it's not going to be a gold coin in a fish's mouth or $1 million bequest, but rather the ordinary, everyday giving of grateful people. And so all those miracles, manna from heaven and all, those are miracles, but the greater miracle is that grateful giving of people who've been forgiven and given hope. Pray with me. Oh God, help us to understand how gracious you have been to us and how grateful we can be. Gift the work of this church and bless us by doing it through us.